What's going on, guys? I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is Replay Rewind. 1,000 video games across 50 years of gaming history. Can I play them all before I die? Well, we're going to find out. This episode is actually a prologue episode. This is not talking about one of the 1,000 games, but rather, since I'm not starting at the exact beginning of this history, and we'll talk about why in a second, I figured I'd do kind of this episode 0, this prologue, to kind of go through like the early history of video games, talk about the games as a medium, to kind of give us a good understanding of what came before we really jump into what's going on. So first we have to, though, define what is a video game. And furthermore, what is art, right? Like what are these terms and what do they really mean? For me, art simply is just human expression, right? If you have something, anything that comes into existence because a human being willed it into existence is art. So a sunset is not art, but a painting of the sunset, a photograph of the sunset, perhaps even the curatorial process of showing someone a sunset, those could be art. The sunset itself is not art, right? The sunset exists without any human intervention. This is a very liberal, broad definition. I'm not drawing any distinctions between good art or bad art. That's kind of irrelevant to what I'm talking about. So this idea of like, are video games art? Like what really people are saying is, are they worthy of academic artistic appraisal? That's not what I'm talking about. It's art because human beings made it. And that's kind of where I kind of fall. There are various artistic mediums or forms or umbrella or bucket, whatever you want to call them. We'll call them mediums. Kind of every kind of work of art kind of fall into. And what's important is that these mediums are discrete and mutually exclusive, right? So there's no overlap, and they're defined by some kind of like key characteristic. So for example, like the cinematic medium, you could describe that as, a film or a video, whatever you want to, whatever kind of specific work it is a reproducible linear sequence of static images, right? Played back at any speed, but at some speed, and the speed's not determined by the viewer. So it's not like a PowerPoint, you're clicking through it. That is how I would define the cinematic medium at its most fundamental level. If you take out any one of those elements, it's not cinema anymore. It becomes something else, right? Similarly, the illustrative medium, right? That you could describe that as a manipulation of shape and color on a two-dimensional space to create a static image that exists in its totality all at once, right? So by this logic, we then need to ask, well, what is the interactive medium's key characteristic? And I would argue it's the input-response relationship. The user-determined electronic inputs, whether it be analog or digital, inputs that result in programmed electronic outputs, right? That input-response relationship. And as you see, we have a picture here of Jennifer Aniston from that really silly 90s, like, semi-infomercial, explainer video about like Windows 95, her and Matthew Perry from Friends. Because this definition I've given for this medium extends beyond video games as we would classically understand it, right? An app would fall under this, a website, even like a DVD menu, right? Like they would all fall in this category of input response, right? So with this in mind, this umbrella term, how do we define a video game then? So this is a definition I came up with quickly. Maybe I could fine tune it even more, but I think for our purposes, this works pretty well. So a video game is a subset of the interactive medium that incorporates elements of game theory to create objective-based interactivity. So notably, again, it's a subset of that medium. And what's interesting about subsets is they're not necessarily discrete, right? Like, the more specific you get, the blurrier the lines are, right? So, like, the difference between a movie and a painting and a game are very obvious. But what's the difference between a feature film and a short film? length, but like at what point does it stop being a short film and it becomes a feature length? Going even further, like genre, like what's really, like where does horror end and thriller begin? Like it becomes a lot fuzzier. So this is kind of the framework we're going to be working with here. That it's the subset of the interactive medium that specifically is oriented towards not just objectives, but arbitrary objectives. Like the idea in game theory that basically games are arbitrary rules imposed for the pleasure of overcoming those obstacles, right? So, in basketball, the simplest way to get the ball in the hoop would be grabbing a ladder and climbing up and putting the ball in the hoop. But that's not the point. The point are the arbitrary limitations and then working within those limitations. So that is what is being brought here to the interactive medium to create this thing that we would call a video game. But then this leads to another question. So what was the first video game? Some of you might guess, well, wouldn't that be Mario? He's like the Mickey Mouse of gaming, right? Super Mario Bros. From 1985. Not quite, right? So 1985 games had been around for long before at this point had been around. And this was, this, a lot of people say this is kind of like the godfather of modern gaming, but it certainly was not the very beginning. Some maybe more historically aware viewers might be saying, oh, wouldn't it be Pong from 1972? Like that's it's so rudimentary. It's literally just, it's rectangle and a little square going bouncing back and forth. That's like the first video game, right? Well, we're getting warmer, but it actually was not the first video game. It was released in 1972. So the first video game, drum roll please, was Computer Space in 1971, an arcade game. And this was the first video game. Except I lied. It was actually the first commercially available video game, not the first video game. So you might be going, well, why are we talking about Computer Space, right? So it's the first commercially available video game. This is where we're going to be starting this 1,000 game journey. This is going to be number 1. This is going to be the episode after this one. But if you're looking for an answer to this question, unfortunately you're going to be disappointed because we don't actually know for certainty what the first video game was. For 2 reasons. One, it depends on your definition. So, depending on how you define a video game, certain early predecessors might be included and others might not be. So we can't necessarily agree. But even if we all had a consistent definition, there's a very good chance, I wouldn't say it's more than half, but it's a non-zero chance that the very first video game ever created may have been created with no fanfare, and it's just been lost to the sands of time. Someone like some computer scientist in the mid 1940s maybe just made something for fun, and they just moved on and they didn't save it and they didn't think about it or talk about it, and so we don't really know, which is really interesting. But that doesn't mean that there's not some indications and some contenders or candidates to be the first video game. In talking about how did video games even come to be. So this is a quote from one of my favorite quotes. I was going to say it's a quote from one of my favorite movies, but it's not really one of my favorite movies. This is from Lion King 1.5. And Timon says to Pumbaa, they're watching The Lion King and they're going to tell the untold story. So he has the remote and they're rewinding it. And Pumbaa says, "Does this mean we're going back to the beginning?" And Timon says, "No, Pumbaa, no. We're going way back to before the beginning." And that's what you and I are going to do right now. So in ancient times, yes, this is how far back we're going. We're going back 4,000 years, 4,000 or 5,000 years. So these video games are inextricably tied to computing and the history of computing, right? And human beings have been trying to come up with ways to compute, to do calculations, for thousands and thousands of years. So this is one of, it would not really be considered a computer by today's standards, of course, but it fulfills a similar function. This is the abacus, right? You probably maybe have heard of this, where you're basically moving beads around, and a certain amount of beads in certain areas represent certain numerical values. So you're able to do, very, very simple arithmetic, addition, subtraction, sometimes multiplication and division. There's still an element, it's hand operated, obviously. You still had to keep track of the numbers to a degree. It doesn't have any memory. It's not saving what you're doing necessarily. So, but again, computers really it's just anything that processes computations, right? So by that definition, this is a computer, and this is basically how we did it for a really long time. Unless you wanted to do pen and paper, but that doesn't really count then, right? We're looking for devices that can process these calculations of these numbers for us. Jumping way ahead, we start to get some development. So we have like Renaissance computers, maybe more accurately Renaissance calculators, right? Where you have basically this ruler type thing. It's called a slide rule. And if you notice there in the middle, there's like a little piece of plastic on the top that's clear. And you'd be able to move it around, and based off of where you moved the slide, different numbers would be next to other numbers, and it would correspond with specific calculations or computations. It was capable of not only arithmetic, but also logarithmic calculations and trigonometric equations. So a lot more advanced than what the abacus was able to do with the beads, which were very revolutionary for the time, but still very simple. That being said, this is also still very simple, again, compared to what we have today. Because, notably here, a human is still very much involved. They are deciding where, it's still very intimately related to the hand movements of moving the thing up and down. And there's not a lot of automation or abstraction. It's a very one-to-one. If you want to know this thing, you slide it over and it gives you the output that you want. But things start to get a little more interesting with mechanical computers, right? So this is a Pascaline or Pascal's calculator. The idea of a mechanical computer is you put in your input on one end, and then you would hand crank it or finger, however it would be cranked. It would still be human motion that transforms that into the gears moving. But the gears start to move, and based off what you put in on the input, on the other end, it will produce a mathematical output. Again, mostly focused on arithmetic, but you start to have levels of abstraction, right? Where people talk about in computing and coding that, in today's age, computers, there's so many levels of abstraction where, like right now I'm recording this on a computer. I'm not thinking about all the code and the math that's happening to allow my little arrow to be able to move around. It's been abstractified so that it's very intuitive. I'm just moving on the mouse pad and the little thing moves around. So we're starting to see that where, it's not the person using the Pascaline does not necessarily know all of the math and steps that are going in the middle to produce the output, right? But again, this is still not ideal because it's still human operated, that it requires human energy to make it work. And this is where we get into automatic computers, right? They're still mechanical, right? But they're also operating with gears in the same way. But what has changed is what powers the gears. In prior, it would be a little crank of some kind. If it was bigger, it'd be like a big crank, right? Now they are using, in the 19th century, they're discovering and implementing all these different energy sources, and that is now being applied to calculators and computers. So, it might be hired with hydraulics, like moving water, or with steam, or especially electricity, right? And the tabulation, would come out on the other end. So I have a picture here. So this is Herman Hollerith's tabulating machine, and he basically created this machine. And they used this in the 1890 United States Census, using like punch cards. And basically they would put the punch card in, and it would based off the punches in the card, the machine would count, okay, one person in this zip code, one person, another woman, another, right? And it sped up the process so much. And a lot of people credit this as kind of like the beginning of like the information age. And again, the tabulation, was now taking less effort, or you could put calories, right? It was coming out on the other end with much less human effort, right? But here's the difference, though. Some of these used electricity, but the electricity was primarily used, if at all, to move the gears, to create the mechanical movement. In the 20th century, starting around the 20s or so, you start to have analog electronic computers, right? So rather than just using electricity to be the force that moves the gears, now we're using electricity itself to do the computations. That we're using the analog electric signal to process these calculations and these computations, right? And because of that, electricity is very powerful and has a lot of detail or information in it. So it allowed for much more complex, mathematical problems and solutions, right? It's still very macrophysical, if that's even a word, where, whereas again today there's so much abstraction with my digital MacBook laptop, that to the point where electricity and the internet almost seem like magic. But we forget it is still physical. But it's so microscopic, the electricity and the movement it's going, right? And it's so fast, it may as well be instant. It may as well be magic. At this point, obviously electricity is a huge jump from the mechanical computers, but because it's analog, which if you don't know the difference, so analog signals are continuous, right? And I'm going to put a pin in digital because we'll talk about that when we get there in a couple minutes. But an analog signal is a continuous signal that can vary with the voltage of the electricity. But these machines, like the differential analyzer from 1927, again, they were still very macrophysical. The precision of these machines could be and were oftentimes limited by physical factors like wear and tear of certain components. And then furthermore, it was, you basically hardwired it, right? You physically built it to do the thing you wanted to do. If you wanted to do something else, you have to physically build it different. So it's hardwired to perform a very specific function. While this was a huge jump from mechanical computers and then it's subsidiary of automatic mechanical computers, despite this being a huge jump, there's still something that's left to be desired, at least compared to what we're used to, right? And this leads to digital electronic computers. So whereas analog signals, like I said, are continuous, smooth, the same way. Here's the best way I heard it described. Let's say you have a distance, right? Like I don't know how long this would be. Let's say this is like a foot. How many inches are in a foot? 12 inches, right? But you could keep segmenting it further and further. So theoretically, there's an infinite amount of space between these 2 points here. In the sense that, there's no point, unless you're getting like really, really microscopic. I think it's like Planck's length or something crazy. There's a smooth gradation of distance that it could be here, it could be here, it could be in any infinitesimally small different places. Whereas analog is like that, digital is binary, right? And that's when you've heard people talk about computers speaking binary. So binary, digital electronic computers like the Colossus Mark II from 1943. This is during World War II. They're trying to find ways to process data more efficiently. The Imitation Game about Alan Turing and trying to break the Nazi code and all that stuff. The hope, was to do all that, and digital computers were far more capable of doing something like that. So what it does is it processes discrete data in binary, in ones and zeros. And all that means is basically there's a little, and I say this also, unless this isn't clear, I am not an expert in computers or computing. A lot of this I just do research on for this video. So, if you know more than me, please comment and let me know. Flesh things out I'm saying. Correct me if I'm getting something wrong. I'd love to hear it. But from my understanding, essentially, there's something's going on in the computer. And there's an electrical signal coming, and it's basically, there's either a wall up or a wall down. Or it's receiving the signal or it's not receiving the signal. So the ones and zeros are basically just yeses and nos. And the computer is constantly switching between these two states of yes or no. Yes, we're receiving signal, no, we're not. And that's what the ones and zeros represent. One means yes, zero means no. So basically, you can then build a programming language in this, based off of this binary electrical signal. Whereas with analog, it's not binary. It's a smooth. It could be an infinite different values for the electrical signal. Here, is the electric signal there, or is it not there? And the benefit of this is that functions of the computer can now be programmed, whereas before we said it had to be physically hardwired to do that. It's literally where we get that term. It had to be hardwired, wired hard, right? Now these digital electron computers or digital computers were highly flexible, right? Now you could build one machine and create different programs for it, as opposed to having to build new physical machines every time. And this is where video games come in. Because if you have a computer that can now be programmed, and it's easier, and you can spend more time on software rather than hardware, this now makes creating playable games much easier, right? It really... Now the opportunity was there. It's not that people were creating this technology to do that, but rather now that this technology existed, this new realm of possibilities opened up. So what we're going to do now is go through a couple video game predecessors. These are all potentially viable to be the candidate for what is the first video game. And we're going to start with Birdie the Brain. So this was designed by Joseph Cates. It is the earliest known, again known because we can't say for sure, earliest known publicly demonstrated electronic game. Demonstrated at the Canadian National Exposition. And essentially it is just a game of tic-tac-toe against a computer, an artificial intelligence, right? Which today that word has a certain connotation. We're not talking about generative AI, we're talking just logic processing, right? The way it would work is that, as you can see in this picture here, there'd be like a little keypad, a 3x3 grid, and the player would enter their move on the keypad, and then the computer would make its move. And the way you saw what moves were being made is that there was a grid of light bulbs overhead, as you can see in the picture. So not a screen, right? It was still you could almost describe it as electromechanical. It had adjustable difficulty, which is interesting. Even back in the day, there were debates about difficulty and it's only the true version is the hard ultimate. And again, based off of my definition, which I had said, what did I say? I'm going to try to find it word for word here. What did I say? So video games are a subset of the interactive medium that incorporate game theory, elements of game theory to create objective-based interactivity. This checks out, right? Because it even though it's not, there's no screen, who says there needs to be a screen, right? Like, I've always thought this, it would be interesting if someone ever did this. Maybe this exists, and someone let me know. There should be like a podcast video game, right? Like, if regular video games are to movies, then couldn't we have something like that, but for audio, where it's like a purely audio game, and it's about, based off of audio cues, what to do with the controller or the keyboard or whatever it is. So the screen is not necessary. You know, we call it video games, but that's just the colloquial word that we use. You know, we're going to just call them interactive games, interactive electronic games. This would fit my definition, right? It is electronic user inputs being met with programmed electronic outputs, right? So Birdie the Brain 1950, where we may very well have our first candidate. A similar predecessor here was the Nimrod computer. This was designed by John Makepeace Bennett. And this was a computer specifically designed to play the game Nim, which I had never heard of. And I had to look it up for this video. So Nim is basically a game where you have like a bunch of piles of stuff, and each pile has a different amount of stuff. And the goal is to, you know, on your turn, you can pick up as many items as you want, but you can only pick from one pile at a time. And the goal is to be the last person to pick up the last object. So basically, it's all about doing like math in your head and going, okay, well, if I take these, then they have to take those, and you know, not super simple, at least to me. Maybe I'm just dumb. Maybe it's actually really simple, but to me, it was like, oh, it's kind of a little more complicated. So they created this computer specifically. It was specifically designed to get hardwired to play Nim. It was still digital, but they still, you know, there's still something about the building the architecture of the computer, right? Like, this is why they made this computer. It was just demonstrated at the Festival of Britain, and similarly, like Birdie the Brain, players pressed buttons that corresponded with lights on the machine, and then the computer would make its moves, and the lights would change. So again, you have this input response relationship. Another game that could be a contender was Draughts, Draughts, from 1952. And I was like, what the hell is Draughts? It's just the British word for checkers. I was like, why do they have a different... Checker already sounds like a British word. This was designed by Christopher Strachey. I apologize, Christopher, if you're still alive and somehow stumbled upon this. I'm sorry for butchering your last name. And like it does what it says on the tin. It's a simulation of drafts or checkers, right? Though it would be printed. You know, I think there was a screened version, but I think the original version was just printed on like teletype, right? Which is how a lot of computers work. They didn't have screens, so it would just be printed. But again, I think later versions were on some kind of digital screen. And it was notable for being the first known electronic game to be created for a general purpose computer, which was the Ferranti Mark I. And again, pretty similar to before, the game board would be displayed with a series of light bulbs. So again, still, you know, no screen until perhaps later. But again, I think the most interesting thing here is that it's being made for a general purpose computer. Similarly, like we're keeping these games very simple. So this is OXO from 1952, designed by A.S. Douglas. And again, it's just a tic-tac-toe game. But notably, it is the first example of a game on this list to use a cathode ray tube, or CRT, visual display. Maybe some of you know what a CRT TV is. You know, that was basically everyone's TV up until maybe 15, 20 years ago. And this is, we're getting, so you can see very, very small, black and white. You know, I don't know what color it would have been in real life had this picture been in color. But again, now we're getting a little more into, it's you know, we're getting video display now, as opposed to having this kind of electromechanical light bulb situation, right? We also have in 1954 Pool, the game of billiards. It simulates billiards. This is designed by William Brown and Ted Lewis. It was created as a demonstration. A lot of these, again, are just built for demonstrations. They were not meant to be like, we're going to mass market this. This was created as a demonstration for the University of Michigan developed mid-sack computer. My sack is mid, am I right? Anyway. The pool stick was controlled by a joystick and knob, right? So you have these little controls. A full rack of balls. All right, I paused for the laugh track. A full rack of balls was displayed on screen, as you can see here in the picture. And notably, it displayed motion with real-time graphics. Whereas, you know, even with something like OXO, it's just basically these binary, and that's maybe a poor choice of words. I don't want to get you confused here, but a binary is the O there or is it not there, right? Whereas with this, you have the balls moving. It's like this real-time situation. And then we get to 1958. So a lot of people would probably say this is the first video game. It seems to be like, no matter where most people start their, like their starting point for the medium. Most people, wherever they put their starting point, usually it includes this. So either they just pick something way before this or they start with this. This is designed by William Higginbotham. It was displayed at the Brookhaven National Laboratory's annual public exhibition as just like another thing at this exhibition, I should say. And hundreds of visitors lined up to play this game. People just couldn't get enough. Wikipedia says, quote, that it was, quote, perhaps the first game created solely for entertainment rather than as a technology demonstration or a research tool, end quote. And I think that's really important, right? That all of these were created kind of just to show off the tech, if you will, of these machines. Sometimes they would be used to simulate physics to solve other problems. Whereas this is really the first time we're getting something that was designed to be a game, right? It was used in analog computer, interestingly. And it's the first 2-player game on this list. Everything before this has been you against the computer, right? PVC, right? And the players used a button and a knob to hit the ball back and determine its arc, respectively. So you'd have this little ball bouncing around, and you can kind of have this game of tennis for 2. And again, people really ate this shit up, but it didn't last. And I think I read on Wikipedia that they didn't know what they really created, so they dismantled the whole thing. So any version that exists now is basically a recreation of it, based off of like notes or schematics or plans or what have you. So again, we're still at a place where, it hasn't set in that this could become a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And then we get Space War. Interestingly, a little fun fact for you guys, this was actually the game I was going to start with, but I ended up moving it to Computer Space, which is fine because Computer Space is actually a remake, essentially, of this game. So this is designed by Steve Russell, and it involves a 2-player dogfight in space. There's a star in the center of the screen that creates like a gravity well. So if the ships don't move or do anything, they just kind of slowly come into the middle. The ships can fire torpedoes, and the torpedoes are not affected by gravity. And there's a limited number of torpedoes and fuel. The game had a wraparound effect, so if you went off on the bottom left, you would then reappear on the, like, I'm going to try to do it. So if you're like coming down this way, right, you would pop up. Where is it? Oh god, this is so embarrassing. You would come up down this way, right? And there was also a hyperspace panic button where, if you're in a tight jam, there was a button you could do that would just zoink you somewhere random in the map. And it was controlled. That's a lot. That's kind of complex. It's the most complex game we've seen so far. It used a joystick, a button, and a switch. And again, very complicated. There's a lot of different mechanics going on. I think, interestingly, they were gonna have this be like a player versus computer, but then, they basically stretched the PDP one, which was the computer they were using. They stretched it to its limit, so there was no more space for the computer for the computer to be playing against you. So it would take up less space to just have just 2 human players playing against each other. And again, because it used like it was the only available program that used every part of the PDP-1's hardware. So before shipping this computer out to potential customers, not potential, people who have paid for it, it was used as a smoke test, right? Which I guess in computing, basically it's just a program you run to make sure the thing is working as it's supposed to be working. So we're slowly starting to get a little more involved, right? Both mechanically involved, right? Like, the application, this is such a big part of games, is that, and this is why a lot of people struggle to get into games if you didn't like grow up with them, is, a movie, you could just watch a movie. A game you have to like learn, it'd be like having to learn, it would be like if watching every movie is different, and you have to learn how to watch each individual movie every time you want to watch a movie. So there's just something about this physical part of it, of the manipulation of the buttons, or the joysticks, or whatever the input method is. So not only are they getting more complex physically, but they're also getting more complex intellectually. That like you're weighing all these different options, right? I feel like it's a little overused, so I'm gonna try not to be saying stuff like this, but people talk about player expression, right? And that's what they look for in games, is being able to have lots of verbs, right? Lots of different kinds of inputs. It's nice being able to combine inputs and have emergent experiences come from them. This is, we're starting to get to a place where, it's becoming a little more, you have to think a little more strategically. And to that end, we start getting our very first strategy game, or one of our very first strategy games. So this is the Sumerian game. This was designed by Mabel Addis, who was a 4th grade teacher. And she is the first known woman, again, known with the asterisk, but she's the first known woman to design a video game, which is really cool. And the game has players managing resources and workers and role-playing as the ruler of the ancient region Sumer in 3500 BC. Again, like I said, it was one of the first strategy video games. It's also the first game with a narrative, if you want to call it that. Like, there's like a context. Even like with Space Force, like you don't know who the spaceship people are. You don't know. Like, it's really just you. It's really just it really is just a game. So this has a narrative of you playing as a character. It's also the first edutainment game, right? Again, she was a school teacher, and I believe this first was made for, school children. Though this 1964 version was, the output was by teleprinter, right? So, you would put in what you want to do, and they would print out the like what happened, physically on a piece of paper. This is, again, pre-screens for most computers. This is how we as the humans knew what the output was to confirm, if it was a calculation, it would print out the answer. In this case, it would be printing out the results of your decisions that you made. But we then got a screen version. So this is Hammurabi from 1968. This is designed by Doug Diamond. It was inspired by the Sumerian game. But this time, though, you play as Hammurabi. And I did not misspell it. The name of the game only has one M, even though the historical Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian king from the 1700s BC, his name had 2 M's. So I did not misspell it. Do not go to the comments and do not collect Go. Do not collect $200. And it's basically the same idea, just again changing the context of who you're playing as. But most importantly, now it's on a computer screen. So it's basically a command line interface, right? Again, even though we have some screens, most computers, if they even have screens, there's no graphics. There's no graphical capabilities. It's all just command line and text, right? But again, this isn't necessarily stopping some games, right? So some games were graphical. So you have Space Travel from 1969. This is designed by Kent Thompson. It's basically a 2-dimensional top-down view of the solar system. Interesting that it's first person, right? This is the first game that we're really getting that is from a perspective, because in a sense, the other games are also first person because it's your perspective. But this is the first time that we're actually assuming a first person perspective of somebody else. And the aim of the game, there really isn't one. The players just attempt to land on various planets and moon, having to contend with gravity, so if they get too close to something, like they're going to fall quicker to that object. Again, it's ostensibly a first person game, possibly the first. So those are kind of all the candidates for, what was the first video game. But, I think it's evident that the medium at this point, as we move into the 1970s, is still going through a lot of growing pains. None of the games are doing all of these. Which way am I pointing? This right. There we go. The games, none of the games are doing all of these, but they're all doing at least one of these, right? So with these games, you still have, analog or electromechanical computing. Sometimes they have very complex, even unintuitive controls. Think like Computer Space. It's like all these knobs and dials and switches. The graphics, of course, are very rudimentary, even compared to what we might see then later in the 70s. A lot of times these are made purely for demonstration purposes, to show off the tech of some new computer. They usually had very limited accessibility. Again, sometimes these were demonstrated at private events or very short events, and then they were dismantled. And then the ones that were accessible weren't commercially available. So sometimes you have some of these like mainframe games, and that people are passing around the source code, but nothing is being sold for money. And this is kind of the state of things as we move into the 1970s, which leads us to coming up. We made it through the first episode 0. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the very first commercially available video game, Computer Space. So that wraps up the episode. I just want to thank you all for watching. If you haven't already, please like this video. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. So if you have stumbled upon this video and you like this, why not subscribe? I'm not sure how far I'm going to get on this journey, but, journeys are always better with others. So I definitely, encourage you to subscribe. You can be part of this community that I'm trying to build. And don't forget to leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this early history and why I'm a dumbass and I don't know anything about the history of computing. Until next time, peace out.